On the UK polls. So let's speak with Paul Whiteley. He is Emeritus Professor with the Department of Government at the University of Essex, and he joins us from Colchester in the UK. Good morning, Professor. Thank you very much, first of all, for staying up late to talk to us. I want to start by asking you about that mandate for Labour. Very clear. But, I mean, is it going to be that Britons will be waking up to a dramatically different UK this morning? I mean, what does the centre-left government actually mean compared to 14 years of a centre-right government and its policies?
Well, it looks like, as you say, a landslide victory for Labour, similar to the one they obtained under Tony Blair back in 1997. And you might recall when that victory occurred, the Labour Party went on to win several other elections and was in power for 13 years. So if the landslide is as big as the exit poll suggests, and the exit polls have been pretty accurate in the past, I can see Labour being in power for 10 years, maybe more, as a result of this. Now, what can we expect from a Labour government? The thing they've been emphasising quite strongly is stability and an end to the turmoil that Britain's experienced since the Brexit referendum in 2016. We've had actually 8 years of real turmoil, several prime ministers, lots of changes in policy, and this has had a bad effect on the economy. And their emphasis very much is on making sure that that comes to an end and that we recover growth. Growth has been very low, economic growth, and encourage internal investment and external investment to get the economy going again. And they've emphasized stability. So beyond that, they haven't made huge numbers of promises, but I think the atmosphere, especially relationships with the European Union, will be greatly improved by Labour government because they've been poor under the Conservatives, and there's been a problem with relationships with the EU since that referendum. So I think we are seeing a sea change, and it might last for a long time. And hopefully, given that we're recovering, as the rest of the world is, from COVID, we're recovering somewhat from the Brexit referendum and, of course, the continuing war in the Ukraine has affected the economies throughout the world. If these things can be resolved, then I think things can get better for Britain under Labour.
Professor, by Friday, Mr. Sunak is likely to be ousted from Downing Street, with his Conservative Party facing its most severe crisis in with over a century. What's next for them, and how might the party redefine its strategies to, regain political relevance and voter trust in the future?
Well, one of the unique things about this election is that for the best part of 100 years, the right in British politics, the centre-right, has been unchallenged. The centre-left has been divided between the Liberals, as they originally were called, and now Liberal Democrats, and Labour. And that's helped the Conservatives a great deal over the years. But this election is unique because that's changed. Now there is a new kid on the block, and it's the Reform Party, a radical right party advocating policies of low taxes and anti-immigration and so on. And this is a trend we've seen across Europe. Only the other day, the French elections proved a significant victory for National Rally. That's the equivalent, if you like, of Reform. And Alternative for Germany, which is also a radical right party, has done well in German elections. So we're seeing a trend in Europe towards support for populist radical right parties. And while Reform, the new party in Britain, won't have a large number of seats in the parliament, it will have important influence, and it's going to be in competition with the Conservatives about the way forward. And Conservatives have already been significantly divided between people on the right, great supporters of Brexit, very big opponents of immigration, and more centrist Conservatives. And now there's going to be serious competition between this new party, which is likely to get seats in the House of Commons, although not many, and the Conservatives in the future. So the Conservatives are really going to have to take the time over the next years, probably a decade, to rethink what sort of party they need to be. Historically, they've always been very pragmatic, changing with the times, willing to change policies and develop. But now they've got a competitor, and we'll see whether this pulls them to the right or actually even splits them in the future. The future is bleak for the Conservatives.
Professor Whiteley, I just want to pick up on this particular point about the shifts that we have been seeing in Europe. The fact of the matter is, I mean, if you think that Labour may hold on to power for the next 10 years, they have the country that has shifted, if you like, to the left, while the rest of Europe has shifted slightly to the right, as you pointed out earlier. I'm trying to understand the implications for the UK and for the Labour Party at this particular point in time, given the shifts that we're seeing.
Well, I think the challenge, and this applies to Europe as well as to Britain, is what kind of new policies emerge and are they successful? The key to electoral success really is not the promises that parties make in their manifestos. Parties all over the world make promises. But the electorate is increasingly sceptical about these promises. What they want to see is delivery. If Labour is successful in delivering prosperity and growth, then it will do well. There has been a debate about Labour's reluctance to make any significant financial commitments towards the public sector, rebuilding the National Health Service, which is in trouble, and fixing public services more generally. Been very reluctant to talk about that, because it will involve spending large amounts of money. But the reality is, to create prosperity and growth, you have to have a long-term plan, and you have to have the ability to spend money to get this done. So the question mark over the new Labour government, even though it's going to have a large majority in the House of Commons, is how is it going to make things better for the average voter rapidly enough, given its reluctance to borrow too much. The lesson of Liz Truss's administration, which crashed the financial markets, looms large in Britain. And there's a very clear concern that that's not repeated. But it might mean recovery, growth, prosperity is held back by a reluctance of Labour to invest heavily. We shall see. But if it does succeed in squaring the circle, borrowing enough to invest and recreating prosperity, it will do well in the future. But I think it has to come up with policies and a long-term plan which will help rebuild prosperity. Actually, historically, Singapore is a very good example of the success of a long-term plan. Over years, it's been a very successful story, but it's been based on long-term strategic thinking. And we haven't had much of that in Britain in recent years. And it's probably time to think in those terms, think in long terms in order to build prosperity and get growth going.
Okay, Professor, we have about a minute on the clock right now. So very briefly, the contest is not only watched in the UK, but also watched around the world. I mean, how do you see the UK under Labour leadership play on the global stage and dealing with, very critical issues like the Gaza, Ukraine, and its relations with China?
Well, foreign policy is not a very salient issue in most elections. The people, who voted have been focusing on domestic policies, the cost of living, immigration, and the National Health Service, and so on. But I think, in terms of the war in Ukraine, Labour will be a steadfast supporter of Ukraine, and it will continue the policy of the previous government, the Conservatives, of supporting President Zelensky and the Ukrainians in light of the Russian aggression. So I think that policy will remain. However, Britain, in relation to Gaza, does not have much influence over what's happening there. It's a major concern to many voters, both here and in Europe. But there is not much leverage that Britain can exercise over both parties. That was not true, of course, in the past when Britain was the colonial power, but it is true now. So I think as far as Gaza is concerned, the policy will not change very much. Labour's policy is for a two-state solution in the area and an early ceasefire. And that's been the policy of the Conservatives, and I think it'll be the policy of Labour too. The one thing that I think will change in foreign policy is that Labour's going to try to get closer to the European Union. We're not going to repeat the exercise of having another vote on whether to join or rejoin rather, or stay out. And the reason for that is simple. It caused such trauma and infighting and divisions in the country, then there's no desire by Labour to repeat that. But you can be pragmatic. You can take issues where we have a common interest in working together with the European Union. Security is one example of that. Trade relationships are another example. And so it'll try to, on a case-by-case basis, get closer to the European Union and patch up some of the disputes that occurred when the referendum took us out in 2016.
Professor Whiteley, just very quickly, is Keir Starmer going to be given time? I mean, does he have a honeymoon period, or is he expected to deliver fairly quickly?
I think he will have a honeymoon period, but at the same time, if you remember, if one looks back at the Blair years, when Tony Blair took over with a large majority in 1997, that Labour government didn't spend more than the Conservatives had planned to spend for the first couple of years. They were very careful about not upsetting financial markets and so on, and didn't really want to do anything. After the second term, they started to invest and spend. I don't think that Labour's got that luxury of waiting 2 years now. Things have got to happen soon and got to move soon, because there's a great deal of discontent. Right. Most of the discontent in Europe with the rise of radical right parties is attributed to economic deprivation. Some of it is about identities, of course, people worrying about their national identities and so on, but it's mainly about economic issues. Right. German economy's not been very successful in the last couple of years, although in the longer run it has been. And the French economy similarly. So it's economically driven. And parties that are incumbent, if they want to challenge the shift towards populism, they have to produce results soon, not overnight, but they have to be seen to be doing something different and moving the countries forward. That applies to Britain, but it also applies to the other major European Union members. Right.
Professor, understood. We are out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you so much for staying up to talk to us. Appreciate it very much. Emeritus Professor Paul Whiteley from the University of Essex.